Hi, I hope you enjoyed the previous lesson on site structure. As we went over, site structure is very, very important so that you can appeal to your user and you can appeal to the search engine. Now that we've gone over site structure, the next step is to learn and to understand how to properly formulate your content. We want to take the same approach where we need to make content that appeals to the search engines but also appeals to the user. Having a website that ranks in Google that nobody takes the time to read or everybody X's out of right away is going to negatively affect your rankings. So there's a really fine balance on how to create well-written, long-form, indexable content that also ranks in the search engine. And in this chapter, we're going to go through the best practices on how to most adequately create and format your content so that it hits both of these criteria. Let's get started. Before I share my screen and I give you guys the behind the scenes access of my personal site as well as the Stodzy site, which we've already been going through, I want to leave you guys with a very, very simple formula. Ranking your content for the sake of clicks is only half the battle. If your content is very educational, but it's not persuading your reader to take some kind of action, then it's almost worse than worthless because you spend all the time, all the money, all the resources creating the content, but you're not getting anything out of it. Content like that gets a ton of traffic and doesn't get a lot of conversions, I call those Wikipedia blogs. Wikipedia is probably the most well SEO'd website in the history of the internet, but there's never any action taken. It's just purely educational, which is fine. That's the point of Wikipedia. But for your agency, you need them to take action. You need them to call. Here's the formula. AIDA. Attention, desire, interest, action. In these two blog posts that we're going to go through, you're going to see how I delicately balance meeting all of the signals and the best practices that we need to rank the content in Google. We balance that with making it easy to read, formatting it properly so that people can skim the content, so that we put bullet points and headers in the right place to grab their attention, while also incorporating a story into the content so that people go through the psychological framework, which makes them want to take action, basically, which makes them want to call you because you are incentivizing them to do so because you have something that they need. AIDA. Attention, desire, interest, and action. Call this the AIDA formula, and you will see this formula take place. I'm also going to leave just some show notes and a PDF in the next lesson so that you can return to this formula and have it just a little bit more written out. So when you're creating your own articles, your own service pages, your own cornerstone pages, you can return to this PDF and apply it. Okay, so let's take a look behind the scenes. One last quick caveat before we go forward. I build all my websites on WordPress. I've mentioned Webflow in this course. I've also mentioned Square and Wix, although I highly, highly suggest that you don't use those. WordPress and Webflow right now are the two most common CMSs for serious agency owners. Almost everybody is going to use WordPress, but if you're using Webflow, I want you to know that these lessons still apply, but there's probably going to be different plugins that you can use. And I'll explain what that means going forward. Just know that even if you are using Webflow, everything I'm about to teach you still applies. You're probably just going to have to find a different application instead of Yoast. And you'll have to do that research on your own. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to me, and I'm happy to assist. Let's talk about content. There's two examples that we're going to use. We're going to use an example on my personal website on timstodds.com. You can see here that I rank number 1 for how to monetize a personal brand. So I'll hit enter and search it. just so you guys can see that. How do you do this? We know that site structure is important. Next, we want to formulate our content in a very specific way so that it meets all three of the criteria. Let's go over those criteria again one more time. We need to appeal to the user. We need to appeal to the search engine. And we also need to convert the user to take action by following the AIDA formula: attention, interest, desire, action. We're going to really go through that over and over again. So let's start with this one: how to monetize a personal brand. This is the back end of timstods.com. This is the actual article. You can see all of the content is here. All of this content is what I personally wrote to rank for this particular keyword. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to look here. We're going to look at this plugin called Yoast Seo. I want everybody to know that Yoast Seo is not the end all be all. There are many instances in which it doesn't make sense to completely stay very, very strict with getting the light green, we call it. And you'll see what that means momentarily. You can see here that this light is orange. And that might not make sense to you right now, but believe me, it will. So what are the criteria for your content? Well, this is why Yoast SEO is so valuable, because it basically maps it out for you. So if you go to Yoast, Yoast is always at the bottom of your content. So this is my content, and we'll see the plugin. Right here, this SEO analysis bar. These are the green dots. This basically means that these are the criteria that I matched perfectly. These are the red dots, which means I didn't do a good job here. And I think we'll probably even find some instances where I might be able to turn these green, and then that'll make the whole dot green. The whole article will be green lit, as we call it. So let's go through these one by one. The first thing we want to do, the absolute first thing that we want to do, is we want to designate a keyword to each article. This is so important, and it's so simple, but it's just lack of organization, which is why people fall victim to this. A lot of times the general consensus is just write the best content and over time you'll rank. If your goal is to get money out of your website, is to get phone calls, to get leads, even to sell product. If your goal is to get agency clients, you want to be as deliberate and methodical as you possibly can. To do this, we create a content calendar, and I will bring you through the content calendar after we go over Yoast. The point is, right here, you want to completely dedicate a keyword to an article. This keyword is monetize a personal brand. So that's your focus keyword. That means that we are telling Google what this piece of content is about. We have a focus keyword. Then what do? We want to make sure we put the focus keyword in our title. Monetize a personal brand. That is in my title of my article, and it's also my H1 tag, which technically is right here. This is just Yoast telling me, or telling Google, that we're going to make the SEO title, the H1 tag, the actual title of the article. And so this is fine. This is my title tag. So this is basically a snippet of what Google sees. And in addition, what the title tag really is it's the link that Google is going to display when they populate your article in the SERPs, in the search engine results page. I can specifically tell Google what this article is about. This article is about how to monetize a personal brand. We put that in the title tag. We spoon-fed Google exactly what it is that we are trying to teach, that we're trying to educate the users who are interested in this particular search query. So that's one criteria. Let's look at this one, key phrase in slug. Your slug is the URL after the root domain. So if we actually click on monetize a personal brand, if we actually click on the article right here, this is the slug. This is a single slug. Image alt attributes. Your image has its own tag. If you ever wonder when you search for an image on Google, like images don't necessarily have words in them, right? You can't index the word. So how is it that Google knows what certain images are about? And the answer is through the alt tag. So if you click on the image and you see this little pencil come up, edit, you click on edit, and here's my alternative text. This is my alt tag. I put my keyword in the alt tag, and here's a really good example where if we search this keyword, and we know I'm ranking number 1 within the all tab, if we click on images, here's the article as well. So if I were to click on this actual image, the image would pop up, and you can see here that here's a link to the article. This is great. This isn't most likely going to help you get clicks, but it's still just another signal to Google that this article is about this particular thing. Remember, with our content, we're taking every opportunity we can just to tell Google what it is that we're writing about. Internal links. So an internal link is a link on a page on your website that links internally to another page on your website. These internal links are important, and we're going to talk more about internal links in the next chapter, where we also talk about backlinks. So you can see right here. Here's one of the internal links. This is a podcast that I did with a guy named Hamish McKenzie. He's the founder of Substack. And bam, you can see pretty clearly that it's a link internally to another page on the website. If your article is 1,200 words, I'd recommend try having 2 or 3 internal links. All right, let's look at another criteria, which is going to be outbound links. It's counterintuitive to think to yourself, why would I want to link out to another website when potentially what I could be doing is bringing a user onto my webpage through organic search and then having them leave by linking out to another site. I want you to not think of it that way, not live in scarcity complex, and instead think of it in the mindset whereas if I'm providing the best resources for any search query, and even if that information links out to another site, the overall value that I am bringing forth and the result that I am going to get by providing just the best value possible is always going to be more than it would be if you were scared to share the resources, if you were scared to link out to other websites. If you approach your content by just providing the best content possible, in the long run, you're really going to get more results than you would have otherwise. So we want to see some outbound links, right? Where are some outbound links on the website? This is how Mark Manson monetizes his personal brand. So in another way, this is a signal. I'm talking about a personal brand, and I'm referencing people who have already built strong personal brands. So all I'm doing is continuing to establish my credibility and my authority through the Google search signals and through the algorithm. The text length, I recommend being at least 1,200 words. Recently, over the last year and a half, almost all of my content has been at least over 2,000 words. You'll see in some of my Stodzy content that it gets up to 3,000 words. I don't recommend writing content for the sake of making it long. Whatever you need to say it in as short as you possibly can. Don't fill your content up with fluff just because you think that there's some external reward in making it long. That's not the case. You want to make it valuable. With that being said, you're probably not going to rank for anything that's 500 words, really 800 words. A good rule of thumb that has worked for me is 1,200 words. And if you have more to say, keep saying it until you've written the best piece of content possible. Previously used key phrase. This is very important because a huge mistake people make, especially in agency sites, is they write about the same concepts over and over again with like different variations of it. And that's fine, because your blog should always be providing credibility and providing authority to your readers. But the purpose of a content calendar is to make sure that every new piece of content you create has some kind of metric behind it. It serves some kind of purpose. There's some kind of potential reward that you can get from that content. And to do that, you want to cast your net as wide as possible. So every time you write a new piece of content, you should be trying to rank for a new specific keyword, and you never want to write a piece of content about the same keyword twice. So this is a really, really important concept and an important thing to keep track of, because 2 or 3 years down the line, once you have a couple hundred articles on your website, it's going to get really, really difficult not to write content from the same keywords. So keep track of this and make sure everything that you write serves a purpose. Okay, keyword, key phrase density. This is less important now than it was. And there are even some SEOs that say the keyword density doesn't matter. I strongly disagree. I've done a ton of tests on this. I've written articles where the keyword was only in the title. I've written articles where the keyword was just in the very top of the article, within like the first sentence. And in almost every case, if you deliberately put the keyword in there at least 1% of the time, then that is ideal. So when I say 1%, let's imagine even 0.5%, right? Let's imagine it's a 1,000-word article. Well, if the keyword is in there 5 times, then 0.5% of the words are the keyword. So we just went through an example on my personal site, but I want to bring you through another example on the Stodsy site. My personal site, Tim Stodds, is a side project. It's a newsletter. It's a way that I bring in consulting clients from time to time. But StodsyInternetMarketing.com is an SEO agency. And so that is directly, it's a direct analysis to what I'm trying to teach you how to do, which is bring in new traffic and bring in new clients for an agency. I'm not going to go in as much depth as I did last time, because this is already turning into a long lesson, but I do want to give you another example on how to use Yoast and follow these best practices. So we see here, emergency room marketing. That's our keyword. I'm going to hit enter again, just to prove to you that this is live. So we have advertisements at the top, 1, 2, 3, 4 ads. And right here, number 1, emergency room marketing, best ways to promote your emergency room facility. This is a valuable keyword. So we have Yoast at the bottom of this page, but the content is going to be on this side. So you're going to see me click back and forth a little bit. We're just going to go through it step by step. You can see here that the smiley face is 100% green. So this is a really, really well optimized piece of content. You can see here our focus keyword, emergency room marketing. If we scroll up to the top, you can see that we follow that same system. We put the keyword in the very front of the title, emergency room marketing, and then some kind of call to action. This is something that we call the curiosity gap, where you want to create a little bit of curiosity on what on earth could that be. Nonetheless, we have the keyword at the very beginning. We have the keyword in the slug, which I will show. I guess I'll pull up a live version of the website. So you can see here, we have the keyword in the slug. If we go through these metrics, we have outbound links in the article, just like we talked about. We're going to link out to really reputable websites. We have internal links in the article. We've linked to 2 or 3 other pages within the website. We have the key phrase in the introduction. You can see that here, blah, blah, blah. And then right down here within the first 100 words, therefore, many emergency rooms are still struggling to maximize patient volume and grow. To solve this issue, here's a step-by-step guide that will level up your emergency room marketing. So we got the key phrase within the first 100 words. That's a great signal to Google. Keyword density. The focus keyword is in there 11 times. And this is a 2,955 word article. So we're still at that keyword density that we talked about last time. Key phrase length. This just means that it's not like a sentence, that the keyword we're trying to rank for is short enough to be something that somebody would actually search. Meta description length. So we didn't cover the meta description in the last article because Google doesn't really care about it that much, but I still advise you fill it out. Just like your title tag right here, what we talked about in the last section, this is what Google sees as the link. Underneath that, right here, this is most of the time the meta description. I didn't cover this in the last one. I won't get too into it, but Google's just gotten a lot smarter over the last few years, and they basically create their own meta description on most searches. But with that being said, I would recommend filling out the meta description, having the keyword in there, and making sure that it is the proper length. Previously used key phrase. We talked about this before. This is the first time and the only time we're going to be ranking for emergency room marketing on the Stodzy Internet Marketing website. Text length, we went through this. Key phrase and title. Key phrase and slug. So there are still a few that aren't green. Key phrase and subheadings. It's a good idea if you can to put the keyword within the header. I don't like to force it. Sometimes if you put the keyword in the header, it just looks a little spammy. And I personally haven't seen that much of a difference. I like to write the content in a way that the user can truly experience the flow of the lesson. And if I can get the keyword in one of the headers, I will do so. If not, I'm not going to worry about it. SEO title width. So I guess we're like a couple characters too long there. And then last one, image alt attributes. We actually do have an image on this article that has the correct alt tag, but it's still going to be orange because there's so many images in this article that it's just the way that Yoast works. They're going to say, you have images on here that aren't optimized for your keyword. Okay, so we've gone through the best practices on how we want to optimize our content. Now we're going to finish off by talking about the content structure. We're going to talk about AIDA. We're going to talk about how to put calls to action on your website and throughout the content so that as people are reading, as you're building credibility to your potential customers and your potential clients, they have opportunities to easily call you or book appointments with you so you can close the deal. Amanda, we're recording. Thank you so much for joining me on my show. I've been looking forward to this podcast for the last 2 weeks, and I'm really thrilled for the opportunity to speak to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this. We're going to mix it up a little bit relative to the usual talks that I give. So this is exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. As you and I chatted a little bit over some documents that we sent back and forth, I start my podcast with the same question on every episode. The background photo of your Twitter account. I want to know what it is and what it means to you.
Oh, okay. This is a good question. Let me think about this for a second. So, so the background on my Twitter account is actually a collage or a mosaic. It's a piece of art, like a graphic art piece that is really a collection of all the things that I love so much about my adopted hometown of Philadelphia. So it has pictures of course, historical figures, Ben Franklin, Independence Hall's on there. I think Betsy Ross may actually be on there as well. Of course, our beloved sports teams, even though secretly I'm more of a Penn State fan. Don't tell anybody.
That's okay.
And let me think what else. Oh, well, there's some pop culture references and the Rocky statue, of course. I think the only thing that's really missing that is near and dear to my heart is like a cheesesteak or a soft pretzel. But in thinking about why I chose that, I mean, this is going to go a little deep, even though I don't know that I
It's
initially
fine. That's why I love this
intended on it.
question. Yeah, that's why I love this question.
I think it's actually like somewhat representative of me as a person. That is, I'm multifaceted and multidimensional, right? I'm not a one-trick pony. There's a lot of things from A to Z that interest me. And so I thought it was a little bit reflective of my personality, not taking things too seriously, like it's not a formal oil painting by any means. It's more of a graphic piece. But I think also it, to some degree, connects and is quite analogous to the world of investing. So even though the subject matter may be totally different from investing, you really have to take a mosaic approach to thinking about all the different variables that impact an investment opportunity or an investment recommendation. And so I think that speaks to me as well, and that I have my hands in a little bit of everything given my roles, but also to make sure that you're really keeping up with and getting ahead of and focusing on really attractive investment opportunities. You really have to look at the mosaic. That's, at the end of the day, we come back to this idea that how all of the pieces fit together and the story that you tell really matters in terms of what the investable opportunity set looks like.
You just said a phrase right there that I find myself repeating very often as I'm working with some of the members of Copyblogger and some of the people trying to build businesses through content. Even this is something that we want to talk about, but more and more I'm finding like independent investors realizing that they need to create brands around themselves, so to speak. And the phrase with that is being multidimensional. There's, I think, a juxtaposition between find a skill set and just be like the best at that one particular skill set. And then there's another area that says like, yeah, that makes sense to an extent, but then as you grow, you'll hit like a ceiling and you need to learn other skills. I'm curious on how that would actually apply to something where I think as being like really one dimensional, which is the world of investing. I mean, basically you want to make money, right? So like
Well,
how
that is
multi-dimensional could it be?
that is the one-dimensional end state for sure. That return on investment needs to be as high as possible. So yes, we're definitely of a capitalist mindset, but I think the path that you take to get there can be very multi-dimensional. I mean, I think I'm living proof of this generalist kind of mindset. Over the course of my career, I've had this long and winding road through the investment management industry and in investing in general. I've done investment banking, I've done portfolio management, I've done equity research. So pulling the trigger on individual stock recommendations, I've been a strategist, and now in my current role, I'm responsible for our entire investment offering, from investment strategy to responsible investing to portfolio construction to manager due diligence and everything in between. And it's really, that is at the heart of what I think investing is. You can be a specialist in a very narrowly focused area, know it inside and out, and be very successful. But at some point, you're right, you do need to zoom out and take a broader view. So you can be a really specialist kind of focused analyst in a particular sector or industry. But if you want to zoom out to be a portfolio manager, you have to have a broader, more macro view that spans the entire market. And so in all of the roles that I have had, they've all required a lot of technical expertise, but really a broad-based view, because at the end of the day, there's so many cross currents impacting the markets and the economy. You have to understand how they fit together. Some, unique variable over on the side here that seems so obscure and irrelevant can actually come into the equation and completely change the dynamic. And so I think one of my strengths has certainly been that ability to be more of a generalist. Maybe I'm not 20 feet deep on a topic, but I'm 3 to 5 feet deep across the board. I think it just gives perspective and context in an investment decision-making environment. So I think that's right. I think the pendulum has swung to such a degree that there's a lot of focus on specializing, even for kids.
Yeah.
Pick one sport when you're 5 and kind of stick through it all the way. I think that works if you want to be an athlete or if you want to be in certain jobs and functions, but I don't think it works well in the investment business. And I think we've seen that play out time and time again.
Well, thank you for that context. Obviously, I was excited to ask that because I'm born and raised in Philadelphia, and I got a wall of art in front of me, and half of it, I don't even realize it until I bring it up, but it's all like Philly stuff. And I think it's really interesting why people from Philly are obsessed with being from Philly, you know? So
it's kind of a cult,
yeah.
You know, we're a rough and tumble bunch here, but we stick together no matter what.
Yes, understood.
Yeah. Maybe it's called the City of Brotherly Love for a reason.
I think so.
Sure.
Well, and I'll go off on a little tangent here, but that is one of the things that I explain to people, like, no, it really is that way. Like, I've lived all across the country, and every time I go home, I just instantly feel like I can walk up to anybody and just ask them a question, or even like touch them to an extent, right? Like, hey man, how's it going? And I don't feel that way anywhere else.
Yep, I totally agree.
Yeah. Okay, so you touched a little bit when we first started recording that this was going to be a different dynamic from the interviews that we usually do, because typically on Copyblogger, I speak to writers who are looking to build an online brand and are looking to either like sell a service or sell a product. In, like I said before, in a lot of cases, like building the brand to increase their status or their clout, to provide deal flow for investment opportunities. And I'm so curious as to how this media mindset is, what's the word, like penetrating itself into other industries that wouldn't traditionally be seen as media friendly, investment banking being one of them. I've been watching your Twitter. I love the videos that you're doing about the updates and the Q1 and the Q2 updates to your portfolio managers. And this is an open-ended question, but I want to know, how has this new mindset that your employer has taken actually been fulfilling itself? Is this something that you think banks, investors, other white collar, I guess the word is, type of industries are going to need to adopt? I just want to hear your insight on this.
Well, let me just say that my employer, that is PNC, has been very kind and generous with me in terms of letting me just, as we say, do my thing.
Yeah.
And so when you see me showing up in Twitter and other social media platforms, I've been given, again, very graciously, a long leash, as it were, to try things and experiment. And so this is not something that we're doing in a broad-based way. This is really just me trying to say, I want to experiment here. I want to try things. I want to put different types of content out. I want to package things in lots of different ways. Still stay true to who we are as an investment organization, certainly our investment philosophy and me as a human.
Yeah.
But I really want to see how far we can push this, because I think the days of, dare I say, I'm sure my marketing communications people will be horrified when I say this, but the days of just doing very formal webinars are so 1990s, right? It's so in the rear view mirror in terms of how we need to be evolving our communications and communication strategy with clients and prospects, and frankly, industry peers. You know, the days of setting something up 3 or 4 months in advance, putting together a formal slide deck, and then showing up on that day and just hitting slide and present, it's not who I am as a person and in general, and it's not where the industry has evolved to. There are definitely times and places for webinars. We haven't completely written that form of communication off, but I think we need to be a lot more nimble and accessible and frankly relatable the way things have evolved. And this is really, again, it's somewhat experimental, so not everything that we do will ultimately stay the course. We can course correct as we go. But I think for me, it's when we try these things and we try to engage very closely on social media and other platforms, it's reflective of the culture of the organization that we are. That is, PNC is a Main Street bank. And we want to be accessible, and we want to be relatable, and we want our folks to know that they can talk to and engage with the key decision makers. I'm just one of a series of spokespeople, but also key decision makers. I lean mostly focused on investment related topics and issues. So that's really where my interface comes into play the most. But I think it's really a natural extension and reflection of the culture of the organization that we have been and will continue to be. And so I think it's really important from a communication and a messaging standpoint that things reflect in that way. Of course, we have the formal company accounts for Twitter, right? We have PNC News. We have LinkedIn accounts that originate from the organization. But I think there's also a real opportunity to make it very personal. And I think the audience or the industry at large is craving this connectivity and this real-time connection and communication. And it's hard to do that when you're an entity. You need to associate a face with a name. And so at the heart of it, I think that's really what I'm trying to do with showing up in all these different forums and venues.
Yeah, I really think that is so cool. And I think it's so cool because you said the word relatability a few times to it. And with respect to everybody, I can't think of anything less relatable than a bank to people. And I remember seeing about a year and a half ago, the Vanguard started putting out YouTube videos on it, but they were still very like cut and dry, dare I say stuffy, right? And what you have been doing and other of your colleagues who I admit I don't know is coming across as personable. It's just you as a person. And one of the things I think that does is you feel like you get to know the people inside of the organization. And someone on my standpoint, you mentioned like build an audience, and that's always what we're trying to do. You're trying to build an audience with your ideas and your insights and the value that you bring to the world. So I guess where I'm going with this is how has Amanda as a person, AKA a spokesperson, seen the audience engaged to certain things for an industry such as investment banking? What is it that you found has been working, and what are things that are kind of coming up short?
Well, I think it's a tough question to answer because we're still in what I would consider a fairly experimental stage. I think what's interesting in particular about Twitter is that I definitely come from a place of love and light. I do not come from a place of hostility and negativity, which can permeate Twitter on any given day in a fairly significant way. And so I try to think of it as a little bit of a breath of fresh air.
Yeah.
And so in any tweet that we're creating and, thinking about concepts for, the idea is really to, put some real analysis in there, but not take ourselves like too seriously. And so if you look through the Twitter feed, on any given day, there might be a panda video, which has nothing to do with investing at all, but it's my spirit animal for a number of reasons. So I like to throw in the occasional panda video. I love a good corny Amanda joke. So hashtag Amanda joke. So I will throw in something, ridiculous or just kind of, I'm struggling with something. I have like 18 meetings in one day, and I, comment like, couldn't you have just given me a Post-it note for that 18th meeting? Like it's just me and my personality trying to, connect with the audience. And even something as simple as I was vacationing in Cape Cod a couple of summers ago, and I posted a sunset video over the beach or whatever it was. And I swear I got more likes and views on that one silly little video than, a lot of the other meaty content that we try to put out there. And so I think it's actually interesting because the followers definitely appreciate the investment insight, but they get such a kick out of like the personal, unexpected parts of it too. And I think that's what is interesting, and I think it keeps people guessing too. You just never quite know what the madness of my mind might suggest we put in the Twitter feed. So it's highly variable. We try to stick to the story of investments for sure, because that is my main charge, but I got to throw in some fun and some love and light from time to time too. And I do think it is well received, both from the followers, but also in terms of the teams.
Yeah.
PNC is a very big organization. We have 55,000 people, soon to be more with the transaction that we're closing soon. So it helps, I think, the teams get a sense of what madness is going on, what's she thinking about on any given day, and depending on what time zone you're in, like it's helpful to kind of track the news flow and what's happening. So there's a lot of benefits to it in somewhat unexpected ways.
Yeah, I love that. I'm assuming that you've seen the one panda video where the little baby is sleeping and then sneezes and scares the mom.
Yes, absolutely.
I
Yes.
know. I've only seen that one like a few thousand times. Every time I see it, I send it to my sister. It's been this back and forth hysterical panda video with the two of
I
us for
can't
the
get
last.
enough panda videos.
Yeah.
In all ways. You can't go wrong with a panda video.
Yeah. I love that. Okay. So then a follow-up on that, other than it just being fun and maybe creating a culture that doesn't take itself too seriously, how has any of this, if at all, been translating to the actual growth of like a PNC audience? Is that something that you guys are taking seriously, or is it just kind of like something that you joke about around the water cooler where it's like, oh yeah, did you see what I posted on Twitter today?
Well, I definitely come from a place of not taking myself too
I
seriously,
can
but where
tell.
the rubber meets the road certainly is, are we making these investment calls, and do they make sense? Do they,
Yeah.
pan out? But also, are we growing the business? Are we reaching additional audiences and followers that we wouldn't have otherwise? And I think the answer is yes. I'll refrain from giving you some specific stats and metrics around it.
You can.
But, if you think about historically, CNBC is kind of like the center of the universe. Again, I don't want to bash CNBC at all. We partner with them and we work with them on a regular basis, but it used to be really the only significant news outlet for business and investment news. And so things have evolved so dramatically. And if you want to reach broader audiences in unexpected ways, you have to think about it from alternative news outlets and news channels. And I'm not talking about TV necessarily. I'm talking about like this podcast that we're doing right now, and a whole host of other podcasts and web-based news outlets. And so we really try hard to be very diverse and versatile when it comes to the channels that we're operating in and partnering with, because we do know that we need to meet people where they are. Not everybody gets their news and their information from the same source, right? It's so disparate. And so in a 24/7 news cycle, when things are moving, as fast as they possibly are, we need to be nimble too and make sure that we are connecting via these different channels. And I think it has been fairly well received, although early, in terms of this experimental plan we have going here. But I think there's a lot of room for acceleration, and we're already building a lot of momentum. So I think we're going to keep doing a lot of these things and doing them in a much more significant way going forward.
Yeah, well, now we're talking, right? Because what we're talking about is essentially going straight to the source. The world isn't dependent on gatekeepers anymore. In your world, it might be a CNBC or a Bloomberg, and in another world, it might be something else where the attention has always been owned by like 5 or 6 huge entities. And we just don't have to do that anymore. And it's not to say that there isn't value in doing that, but it, in my view, even in your industry, 5 years from now, we're going to look back at a moment like this, and there's going to be the companies that decided like, yes, let's start creating our own native media, right? Let's get on these direct to audience publications like a podcast or even like a blog or what have you, and just go directly to the people where they are. And I think this is going to be kind of an open-ended question. I'm just looking for your insight, but I think 5-10 years from now, we're going to see a huge differentiation between companies that started taking it seriously right now and the ones that are going to be like, oh man, we got to start doing something to really get caught up. What do you think about that?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I agree with you. I will admit that I'm not necessarily a first mover in terms of exploring these channels. I've only been on Twitter for the last few years, and so it's been a very grassroots effort on my part to build engagement, build followers, build a presence there. But I think that's absolutely right. You know, the pendulum is not going to swing back in the other direction. It's going to
Yeah.
continue to swing further towards a more disparate set of news outlets and venues. And so I think we need to certainly evolve as the industry evolves, but try to get ahead of it to some degree as well. That's it. Really, the wave of the future is certainly thinking about things in a more alternative, diverse way, but I would say that wave is kind of already here too.
So what do you think that's going to look like? Is PNC going to have their own media studio? I mean, I can't see why not, right? You're going to have your own podcast, your own shows. Like, how would that play out in an organization such as yours or even comparative organizations?
Well, it's a good question. I'm not sure that PNC is focused on investing in a studio per se, but I like where you're headed with it for sure. I'm definitely already working on an audio podcast. We have a few segments that are out there. And so again, it's another channel for us to distribute content in a little bit of a differentiated way. So I think, again, I don't know that I have a crystal ball answer for you in terms of what this is ultimately going to look like. I just know things are going to move a heck of a lot faster than they already have been, which is pretty fast and hard to keep up with. And I think we're just going to have to be a lot more nimble and experimental going forward. And so it's not so much like picking one channel. Like, it's not necessarily Twitter being the center of the universe. I think it's the ability, the folks that will be successful in leveraging media and media platforms will be able to stay true to themselves and take the content that they're intending on producing, regardless of the outlet, and slice and dice it and package it so that it makes sense hosted on whatever platform or in whatever news outlet and channel that is. So that is the content that we put together and use on Twitter. There are themes and there's rhyming to some of what is there, but it's also very specific to Twitter because we understand that things get stale very, very quickly, and you have to comment on things like in the moment that they're happening, or it kind of fades from your feed, whereas other things have greater shelf life. And so I think it comes down to, like, the future state is really being versatile, still staying true to having the meaty content, but making sure you own the packaging of that content and that it fits and resonates with the channel that you're operating in. And it should be all those, all of the above, those channels that are out there.
Yeah, so interesting. It always cracks me up how Twitter continuously just seems to be like the center of the universe, no matter like what people, no matter who I talk to, right? And there's always the same theme. It's like, well, I really love it, but it's also really toxic, but somehow I can find the places that aren't too toxic. And I don't even know where I'm going with that. It's just seemed to be like a really common theme throughout my show, that if you're in fitness or if you're in banking or if you're in content, I've even, talked to a couple of crypto people. They're always like, yeah, well, the center of the world is Twitter. But okay, what I'm actually trying to say there is you said something that is very important to my ethos as a marketer and as what we advocate people with Copyblogger do, and that is owning your media, right? And so I think that's why, at least this is my assumption, if you're going to go with podcasts, that gives you something that's actually yours. There's a sustainable intellectual property right, so to speak, where now you own the distribution and you can go directly to the audience that you're trying to build. Is that something that is in the crosshairs of what you guys are doing in the future, or is that just the next right step for you?
I don't have much to say on this topic other than yes, absolutely. It is top of mind for us, and I think it will continue to be top of mind for us going forward. absolutely, that has to be the name of the game, both today and into the future.
Yeah.
Yep.
Great. I want to switch it up a little bit. We've talked about the idea of content as marketing, but I always find that in my show, my favorite people to talk to are writers, are great writers. I have just a soft spot in my heart for writers because out of all the different ways that people can like quote get internet famous these days, I always feel like writing is still and kind of always will be like the hardest and the most valuable one. And I read a majority of your blog posts. I read the strategy insights, especially, and I'm reading it thinking like, man, how long did this take to put together? And I'm one of those nerds that likes to read insights like that. So where has writing fallen for you in terms of like helping you with your job, in terms of helping you be a better thinker, a better processor of information? Again, an open-ended question, but I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, thank you for calling that out because writing is so hard.
So hard.
And I really feel like it's a lost art.
Yeah.
You know, it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to really put something together, again, package it, and ultimately explain it in a very digestible, engaging sort of way. So I really appreciate you calling that out because I'm definitely a 18 version kind of person, you know, like 18 versions of a Word doc before I finally get it to where I feel comfortable with it. That's my process, right? I'm not the kind of person that sits down and cranks out something, boom, you're done. I go through lots of iterations and I read it out loud and I read it to myself and I'm like, does this really make sense in terms of how I'm explaining this? Because I'm always aiming for the non-investor, right? How do I explain a seemingly technical or sophisticated topic to a non-investor and not bore them to tears? And so that's ultimately my objective. And it takes time to figure that out. And it takes a level of expertise that isn't really necessarily inherent. You know, being able to understand all these key technical terms and sophisticated topics, you know, is one thing, but being able to explain it or teach it in the written form is another level entirely. So I work really hard at it, as does the team for sure. I think what's important though in thinking about writing, communicating, you know, whatever channel it might be, you could have the greatest investment ideas in the world, but if you can't figure out how to communicate them in an effective way, in an accessible way, in a compelling way, it's basically not going to be a success because whoever you're talking to probably isn't going to bother investing in it. At the same time, like we spend a ton of time in the numbers and the data, like you have to as an investor. That disciplined, repeatable investment process, all of that analysis really does underpin our views and recommendations. So if you can explain things clearly, if you're a great writer, but you don't have the underlying fundamentals nailed, that is, the investment thesis stinks, to use a technical term, that's not a good outcome either. And so I really think about this as you got to have your left brain and your right brain kind of working in concert to really make this gel and make this a compelling, whatever, paper, you know, story, investment thesis. And it takes time. It's hard to put that together in one sitting for sure.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why people don't stick with writing, because it's, you know, you can make a video on Twitter and get the dopamine hits all of a sudden, or you could spend like 2 weeks on a long form blog post and maybe like your cousin comments on it, right? And then, you know, in order to get good at writing, it takes years and years. But like I think you really nailed it. Where, and I'm going to make an assumption for you. Tell me if I'm way off. But in most cases, the act of writing it, of learning about it and basically teaching it to somebody else also makes you better at the job in the first place, because you can have all the analysis that you want and feel like you have a grasp on it. It's always that Einstein quote that comes to my head, like, unless you can explain something simply, you don't really understand it.
Absolutely.
Think so?
100% agreed. Let me just say though, just to riff on what you said before about the writing long form, I have to say, like, even though I'll go through 18 versions of something to get a fairly lengthy white paper nailed down, 280 characters is pretty tough.
It is.
So, I could have 20 pages and I'm just writing away, like I
Uh,
eventually get there in terms of describing things, but in 280 characters, you really kind of have to cut to the chase. And so I have to say, like, they're at opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of writing, but that 280 character limit is quite a challenge to say, this is the key message, this is why it
yeah.
matters, and not give all of that underpinning and analysis. So it's a very different type of writing
Mhm.
and equally challenging, but for different reasons.
Yeah, it's is it some quote, I don't know who said it, but if I had more time, I would have wrote a shorter book.
There you go. That's exactly it.
Hmm.
Yes, absolutely. So what we try to do with Twitter and LinkedIn and other channels is give folks enough to pique their interest, but kind of leave them wanting a little bit more. And that's what I guess Twitter threads can be for. You
Hmm.
can build on an initial tweet and get a little bit more meat there. But yeah.
Sure. I want to dig in just for a little bit longer about your process. As somebody that speaks to a lot of writers, we have a membership community, and we teach people how to write for the internet. And one of the most common questions I get is just about the process. So this is a little bit of a technical question, but it really is a it's an art to take something, compress it in as short as words as possible, and do so in a way that like most articulately portrays your message. So do you start by just writing everything that you can think of? Are you like a writer first and then 80% of the time an editor? Do you go through it and kind of chop it up and edit it as you go through your pieces? To get a little bit specific for me in terms of what the process looks like.
That's a really good question that basically no one has ever asked me before.
Good.
So let me think about it. Well, I would start with, if I'm writing a white paper, I always start with an outline
Yeah.
just to try and get the key building blocks of the topics kind of narrowed down, because otherwise I could be off the rails by the second page for sure, for sure. So I try to have a target, and that usually starts with an outline. But believe it or not, I have a lot of trouble writing lengthy pieces without coming up with an intro. And again, I'm not a professional writer per se. Like, I'm not trained at all. This is me just
Yep.
doing my thing, trying to figure it out here. But I always have to start with, what is my catchy intro? What
Mm.
is my shtick or hook to get people interested before I can build out the rest of it? I may know all the key topics and analysis and pieces that I want to include in the middle of the paper, but if I can't come up with a clever intro, it's like massive roadblock for me. So I'm always trying to come up with like a musical reference or a pop culture reference. Like, we wrote a paper a number of quarters ago now. It feels like just yesterday, but a number of quarters ago on negative interest rates. And we titled it The Upside Down World of
Or
Negative
Stranger
Interest Rate
Things.
Policy, Stranger Things reference,
Yeah.
right?
Hell
So
yeah.
immediately I was like, oh my God, it's like the upside down world. Like, you get sucked into negative interest rates and it's really hard to extricate yourself. And so sometimes it comes together fast like that, and
Mhm.
other times I just agonize over what that hook ultimately is. But for me, that's always the starting point, is to build the outline and then try and figure out what my hook is, to make sure that whatever I'm writing about is interesting and engaging and hopefully somewhat unique. And then once I have that together, the rest of it starts to flow. And to your question about like writer versus editor, in my more recent roles, I have tended to be a pretty vicious editor as I get out my proverbial or digital red pen for sure. But I also like to write a lot of things too, because I feel like that's the way for me to get my voice expressed and heard. And so it's some combination of both, but just by the nature of how my roles have evolved over time, it has lended itself more recently, not on Twitter, but in publications, being more of an editor. And it's funny because it's not that I'm making technical changes or sophisticated changes around the analysis. It's all about the style and the positioning and the context and the narrative. Like, how do we tell the story of whatever crazy nonsense is happening in the market? How do we make it relatable? And so that's my spin, and that's how I usually show up in terms of an editing context.
This is great because you're accidentally, it seems like, hitting on so many of the things that we preach. One of them being an intro, but you also talked about what you're aiming at. And I think one of the other hard things about it is I actually like visualizing it. I think to myself, when I write this thing, what is the one thing that like I'm aiming at, and going as small as possible. So, okay, you got your outline, you got your intro, but as you're putting your content together, do you keep that in your head? Like, what is this one specific thing that I'm trying to say?
Oh, absolutely. Especially when it comes to an investment recommendation. You
Yeah.
know, we know where we're trying to get to. We know what the analysis and the investment process has kind of borne. And so how do we weave it? Sometimes it's a long and winding path, but how do we weave it ultimately to a high conviction investment recommendation or portfolio adjustment or whatever the case might be? So yeah, you have to be strategic, and I think you have to be a little bit visionary, but not in the context of years down the road when you're writing a paper, but when you first start, you know, at the outset of the paper, you absolutely have to have the end goal in mind. I guess I take that a little bit for granted, that it just is in there inherently, but it is an important part of the process for sure. If you don't know where you're ending, you don't know what your recommendation is or what your compelling argument is going to land on, it's very difficult to write a concise, compelling piece, because then you just end up being a stream of consciousness. And while that can be fun and interesting depending on the brain, we know that our clients don't have the attention span for a stream of consciousness. So we try to cut to the chase as much as we can.
Yeah. Well, excellent. Thank you so much for that insight. We got a couple of minutes left. I want to touch on something that I briefly hit on before. So we have people that are accountants, even some investors, CPAs, people that think traditionally like, why on earth am I going to bother creating content for my business? Like that's not going to help me. And I guess I'm looking for like a little insider trading here with people who are in this field, maybe some of your colleagues, maybe people that would have or do belong to drier industries. What's the buzz like behind the scenes? Is this something that people are really thinking about? Do I need to start creating content for my company, for myself, for my own career? What's happening in these, maybe let's say like non-creative type industries and niches?
Well, I think it creates a stickiness. I think it creates a relationship. You know, I
Yeah.
think about the investment business as a relationship business first and foremost. Yes, there's portfolios. Yes, there's data and numbers and analysis. But at the end of the day, it's a relationship and it's a trust business for sure. And so that bond that you create with your clients, and that they hopefully in turn create with you, really develop a stickiness. And that's important to translate not just from a client and service provider perspective, but also to the teams within the organization. Like it's not just a client-facing relationship, it's how we all work together, the symbiotic nature of relationships. But I think it also needs to show up in terms of communication. And so if you can develop content and really develop engagement and that relationship stickiness, I think that speaks volumes. It's not just about the transaction and the day-to-day. It's leaving them wanting more in some way, shape, or form in terms of what you might say next or what you might do next, but also giving them something to trust in and believe in. And I think that has a much longer time horizon to it than just a transaction. And so we do think about it that way. Again, it comes back to kind of that Main Street, accessible, relationship-oriented model. And so yes, for sure, things can get dry and technical in the investment space for sure. That's why I spend so much time thinking about pop culture references and music references, just as much as I do stock charts and macro trends, because we need to find what that intersection looks like. I'll give you a good example of some of the stickiness and excitement out of what seemed like kind of a small and maybe corny thing when I initially started doing it, but it's really picked up in terms of interest and steam. And so in 2000, I think it was in 2017, I decided that I was going to try to pick a song or musical reference that was going to characterize the new year. So this is get out the crystal ball, right? Let's try and figure out what we think based on our investment outlook. Is there a song out there? Is there a band out there that might be reflective of this? And we're going to try it for 2017, and then we're going to, if it worked out okay, we're going to try it every year. And so we've been doing this since 2017. And so back then, this, not to get too in the weeds, but back then we went with like the year of investing nirvana. It was a combination of low interest rates, low inflation, low volatility, and sky high returns. So from an investment perspective, it was like Nirvana, yeah. But also the band Nirvana. And so it evolved from there. 2018, I think was a Led Zeppelin reference, like No Stairway to Heaven for Gains, right? So we're starting to bring in more song references. 2019 was my personal favorite. I think if I had to pick a spirit song, I would go with Journey's Don't Stop Believin'. Nice. So we used that in that year. It was a very challenging backdrop coming into 2019. The market had corrected a lot. And then we finished the year in a really strong, positive place. The market rallied over the course of the year. So that one worked out. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to get to 2020 because that's the one where things went a little sideways. We went into 2020, of course, not foreseeing a pandemic, but we did think that there was still some brightness ahead in the economic backdrop. And so we went with the Grateful Dead's Truckin', cool. Which obviously by the end of February did not work out so well, but we were able to salvage it because at the end of the year, it was what a long, strange trip it had been. So I'm still going to count it as a win for versatility. But what's funny about this and sort of dragging you through all of these is it got to be a really interesting, fun activity kind of at the end of each year and thinking about the new year to the point where I would get clients and prospects lobbing in suggestions for musical references and questions about when we were going to unveil it and what it was going to look like in the investment outlook. And it's such a small, silly, if not corny little thing, but it's created such stickiness and interest and engagement on a topic that might be otherwise completely off someone's radar. And so it's small little things. It doesn't have to be grand sweeping changes. It doesn't have to be this huge effort. Again, I keep coming back to grassroots, right? Mm-hmm. Small incremental changes can have really significant impact. And so I think creating content and driving engagement and relationship building through it is just absolutely critical in terms of the path forward. That's how we succeed long term in this business.
I think you're absolutely right. I love that story. I'll finish with a little anecdote on my own. I basically built my first business by creating healthcare content. So I would write like market insights on healthcare industries that nobody realized were a thing now. And who wants to read about that, right? And a couple of years into it, we had this joke on our blog running about how there's just an inside joke in healthcare that doctors are like terrible businessmen because they are. I mean, I don't know, they just are.
No comment.
yeah. And so month after month in our newsletter, we would always create a story, which is like the Dr. Fail of the month, which was some really, really cool business idea that some like super brainiac doctor took over and just plummeted to the ground. And coincidentally, well, maybe not coincidentally, but it seemed like new emerging industries like stem cells were one of them, and some PRP stuff, some like real cool healthcare science that I find is very fascinating. these were over and over again, seemed to be these brainiac doctors that saw this opportunity and just drilled it into the ground. And so over months and months and months, this ridiculously dumb concept that we came up with turned into, I guess we kind of went viral in a way, right? And so this super, what I thought to be dry market insights on health tech and new like emerging healthcare businesses turned into a really, really cool content play. And it really helped us. So like, I'm just relating to that story in that no matter what your field is, it's totally possible to build relatability through these new media forms that we see.
Yep, I love that story. You
Thanks.
created your shtick, you
Yeah.
created your hook, and it had people wanting more, right? You left them wanting more to hear what crazy thing was going to happen next. So that's awesome. Yeah,
Yeah.
love
Thank
that.
you. It was a lot of fun. Good time in my life when we all actually went to the office together and would like throw stuff at each other, you know? Uh,
Those days hopefully will be here again before we
God,
know
I
it.
hope so. Because now it's like I look at this silly little space station that I've created and it's like, am I ever going to get out of here?
I'm trapped. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right,
For
Amanda.
sure.
Well, man, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for jumping out of your, might I call it, comfort zone to have this conversation with me. I think people are going to learn a lot from the insights that you have, and keep tweeting. I'm a fan of what you're doing, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it. You've definitely pushed me to think creatively and more outside the box relative to what I usually do. So I love it. It's been great. I hope we can catch up again soon.
Yeah, me too. Okay. I'll link up your Twitter and pnc.com and all the show notes. People can find that.